The bustling streets of downtown Chicago buzzed with life, the sound of car horns blending with the chatter of pedestrians and the faint hum of a street musician's saxophone in the background. Among the crowd, a black man in his mid-30s walked confidently, dressed in a sharp navy suit that hugged his athletic frame. His polished black shoes clicked rhythmically against the pavement, each step purposeful. His name was James Carter, but most people knew him simply as Agent Carter. James had an air of quiet authority about him. Years of training as an FBI agent had taught him to observe, assess, and stay calm under pressure. But on this particular day, as he made his way to a meeting with a confidential informant, James had no idea that his badge and title wouldn't shield him from what was about to unfold. Just a few blocks away, Officer Greg Miller leaned against his patrol car, sipping coffee and scanning the streets with a scowl. Greg was the type of cop who believed in profiling, convinced that certain people fit certain descriptions. He'd been on the force for over a decade, earning a reputation among his colleagues as someone who played by his own rules that often towed the line of ethics and legality. Greg's partner, Officer Julia Ramirez, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through the police radio log. She was younger, less jaded, and still trying to find her place in the department. Julia often felt uneasy around Greg, especially when his biases became evident. She'd learned to keep her head down and pick her battles, but something about today felt different. As James rounded the corner and approached a busy intersection, Greg's eyes locked onto him. The suit, the confidence, the posture, it didn't matter. To Greg, James was just another black man walking through a part of town where Greg thought he didn't belong. "Look at this guy," Greg muttered, setting down his coffee and straightening his belt. Julia glanced up. "He's not doing anything, Greg. Let it go." But Greg wasn't listening. He was already stepping out of the car, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Julia hesitated, torn between following her partner and her growing sense of unease. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Greg barked, his voice cutting through the noise of the street like a whip. James paused, turning slowly to face the officer. His expression remained calm, though he could feel the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He'd been here before, not as an FBI agent, but as a black man in America. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his tone steady but firm. Greg approached him with a sneer. "We'll see about that. Hands where I can see them." A small crowd began to gather, sensing the tension. James noticed the curious stares and pulled out his wallet, holding it carefully in front of him. "I'm reaching for my ID," he said, his voice loud enough for bystanders to hear. But Greg wasn't interested in IDs. Before James could say another word, Greg grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Hey, what are you doing?" Julia protested, stepping out of the car. "He fits the description," Greg snapped, ignoring her. James winced, but stayed composed. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," he said evenly. "I'm a federal agent." Greg laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. "Yeah, sure you are. That's a new one." As Greg tightened the handcuffs around James' wrists, Julia's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it hesitantly, listening as a voice on the other end gave her a piece of information that made her stomach drop. Her eyes darted to James and to Greg, who was oblivious to her growing panic. "Greg, stop," she said urgently, her voice shaking. "You don't know who this is." But it was too late. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the truth was about to come crashing down in a way none of them could have anticipated. Greg tightened his grip on James' arm, ignoring Julia's protest. The bystanders murmured in confusion, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. James stayed calm, even as the handcuffs clicked shut, his breathing steady but measured. Inside, his mind raced. He had dealt with hostile situations before, but this one hit differently. The injustice of it stung, but he knew better than to let emotions take control. "I told you," James said, his voice firm but composed, "I'm a federal agent. My badge is in my jacket pocket. Check it before this goes any further." Greg scoffed, his smirk widening as he pushed James toward the patrol car. "Oh, we'll check, all right. Got a fake badge to go with that fake suit." "Greg," Julia's voice was sharper now, laced with urgency. "We need to talk. Now." "Not now, Ramirez," Greg snapped, waving her off. "I've got this handled." But Julia wasn't backing down. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Greg could hear. "I just got a call from dispatch. It said a federal agent named James Carter was supposed to be in this area today. He's with the FBI, Greg. This is him." For a split second, Greg faltered, but his ego wouldn't let him admit he might have made a mistake. Instead, he doubled down, turning to James with narrowed eyes. "If you're really FBI, then you won't mind coming down to the station. Let's clear this up there." James held Greg's gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're making a serious mistake, officer," he said quietly. Greg opened the patrol car door, gesturing for James to get in. Julia stood frozen, torn between her loyalty to her partner and her growing sense of dread. The crowd had grown larger now, the hum of murmured conversations filling the air. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, wondering how this situation would end. James stepped into the car without resistance, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew better than to escalate the situation. As the door slammed shut, he caught a glimpse of Julia, her face pale and tense. Inside the car, James leaned back against the seat, his mind piecing together what had just happened. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way Greg probably expected him to be. Years of experience had taught him to compartmentalize his emotions, to focus on the bigger picture. But this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that allowed officers like Greg to operate unchecked, to let their biases dictate their actions without accountability. Greg climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at James through the rearview mirror. "Hope you've got a good story for us when we get to the station," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of the situation was already beginning to shift, though Greg didn't realize it yet. Julia sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Her mind was racing. She didn't always agree with Greg's methods, but this felt different. It felt wrong. She'd seen enough today to know that James wasn't some random guy off the street. The way he carried himself, the calm confidence in his voice. It all pointed to someone who was used to being in control, someone who didn't belong in the back of a squad car. As they pulled away from the curb, the crowd began to disperse, though a few people lingered, their phones still recording. The videos would surface online within hours, sparking outrage and debate. But for now, the streets returned to their usual rhythm, the moment fading into the background like a fleeting shadow. The car ride to the station was tense, the silence broken only by the crackle of the police radio. Julia stole glances at James in the back seat, her unease growing with every passing second. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Greg, we need to stop," she said firmly. Greg let out a bitter laugh. "Stop. Are you kidding me? We're doing our job, Ramirez." "No, we're not," Julia shot back. "This isn't right. You didn't even let him explain. You didn't check his ID. He just assumed." "Assumed what?" Greg interrupted, his voice rising. "That he was up to no good. Because guess what, Ramirez, 9 times out of 10, I'm right." Julia shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "You're not right this time, Greg, and you know it." Greg didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he stared straight ahead. In the back seat, James listened quietly, his sharp mind absorbing every word. He wasn't surprised by Greg's attitude, it was all too familiar. But Julia's pushback intrigued him. It wasn't often that he saw someone challenge their partner like that, especially in a situation like this. When they arrived at the station, Greg wasted no time pulling James out of the car and leading him inside. Julia followed reluctantly, her stomach churning with anxiety. The desk sergeant looked up as they entered, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise when he saw James. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Picked him up on suspicion," Greg said curtly. "Suspicion of what?" James asked calmly, raising an eyebrow. Greg ignored him, turning to the sergeant instead. He claims he's FBI, but I'm not buying it. Figured we'd check it out here. The sergeant hesitated, his eyes flicking between Greg and James. There was something about James' demeanor that gave him pause. He didn't look or act like someone who'd been caught doing something wrong. In fact, he looked more like someone who was used to being in control. I'll need to see some ID, the sergeant said carefully. James nodded. It's in my jacket pocket. If one of you could remove it, you'll find my badge and credentials. Greg reached into James' pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open, his face paling as he stared at the gold FBI badge inside. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. James met Greg's stunned gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. Now he said evenly, "Are we going to have a real conversation, or do I need to make a few phone calls?" Greg's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time that day, he was at a loss. Julia watched the scene unfold, a mix of relief and unease washing over her. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As James stood there, still handcuffed but undeniably in control, one thing was clear: the tables had turned. But how far they would turn, and what it would mean for everyone involved, was a question that remained unanswered. For now, the truth hung in the air, waiting to unravel in ways none of them could predict. Would you like me to continue, or adjust the pacing or tone? The room seemed frozen in time as Greg stared at the FBI badge in his hand, his mind scrambling for a way to rationalize what had just happened. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him. His pride refused to let him fully acknowledge it. His grip on the badge tightened, his jaw clenched, and his face turned an uncomfortable shade of red. James remained calm, standing tall despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already unraveling before everyone's eyes. The desk sergeant cleared his throat, breaking the suffocating silence. "Greg," the sergeant said carefully, his voice low but firm, "you might want to take those cuffs off. Now." Julia, standing off to the side, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She'd never seen Greg look so unsure of himself. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, but another part of her couldn't shake the unease settling over the room. This wasn't just about Greg making a mistake. This was about something much bigger, and she could sense it. Greg hesitated for a moment before stepping toward James, unlocking the cuffs with a shaky hand. The metal clattered loudly as they hit the desk, the sound echoing in the tense space. James rubbed his wrists briefly, then adjusted his suit jacket with deliberate precision. His movements were measured, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," James said, his tone neutral, but edged with quiet authority. He turned to the desk sergeant. "I'll need the name of your commanding officer, and I'd like to make a call." The sergeant nodded quickly, gesturing toward a nearby phone. James walked over and picked up the receiver, dialing a number from memory. Julia watched him, curiosity tugging at her thoughts. Who was he calling? And what would happen next? Greg, meanwhile, stood rooted in place, his mind racing. He could feel Julia's eyes on him, her silent judgment cutting deeper than anything she could have said out loud. He wanted to lash out, to defend himself, but the weight of the situation kept him quiet. As James spoke into the phone, his voice calm and professional, Julia's curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer to Greg, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "What are you going to do now?" Greg didn't answer. He didn't have one. A few minutes later, James hung up the phone and turned back to the room. His expression was still calm, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. "I've made my call. Someone will be here shortly to address this." The sergeant nodded again, his discomfort evident. Julia glanced at him, noting the beads of sweat forming on his brow. The tension in the room was suffocating, and it was clear that no one wanted to be the first to speak. Outside the station, the buzz around the situation was already growing. Several bystanders who had recorded the arrest had shared their videos online, and the footage was spreading like wildfire. Comments flooded social media, with people expressing outrage, disbelief, and in some cases, support for James. The videos captured not just the arrest, but also the subtle dynamics between Greg, Julia, and James. The public was forming their own narratives, each one adding fuel to the fire. Back inside, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the station. The door swung open, and a tall man in his 50s walked in, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was dressed in a crisp dark suit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. James's face softened slightly at the sight of him. "Agent Carter," the man said, his voice warm but firm. "I came as soon as I could." "Thank you, Director Mills," James replied, extending a hand. Greg's face went pale as he realized who this man was, the director of the FBI's regional office. He had seen him on TV at press conferences, standing alongside high-ranking officials. This wasn't just some random supervisor. This was someone with real power. Director Mills turned to Greg, his expression hardening. "Officer Miller, is it?" Greg nodded stiffly, unable to meet the man's piercing gaze. "I've already been briefed on what happened here," Mills continued, his tone sharp. "Agent Carter is one of our most trusted field agents, and this situation is unacceptable." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Mills held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. We'll be conducting a full investigation into this incident. In the meantime, I suggest you think very carefully about your actions today and what they represent." Julia watched the exchange, her stomach churning with a mix of relief and apprehension. She was glad James had someone in his corner, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As Mills turned his attention back to James, Greg's frustration finally boiled over. "Look, I was just doing my job," he blurted out, his voice defensive. "No," Mills said sharply, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to let your personal biases dictate your actions. There's a difference, Officer Miller, a big one." Greg fell silent, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of Mills' words. James watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. He could see the cracks in Greg's bravado, the way his confidence had crumbled under the scrutiny of someone with real authority. But this wasn't just about Greg. It was about a system that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked. As the tension hung heavy in the air, Mills turned to James. "Agent Carter, you have my full support. We'll make sure this is handled properly." "Thank you, Director," James said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about accountability, about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. I want this addressed at every level." Mills nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And it will be. You have my word." The weight of the conversation settled over everyone in the room, each person grappling with their own thoughts. For James, this was a moment of validation, but it was also a reminder of how far there was to go. For Julia, it was a wake-up call, forcing her to confront the realities of the system she was a part of. And for Greg, it was the beginning of a reckoning, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. As the scene unfolded, the world outside continued to watch, the story spreading further with each passing moment. The tension in the station was just a microcosm of the larger conflict playing out in real time, a conflict that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The silence in the station was deafening as Director Mills and James exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. Julia, standing on the sidelines, could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her partner's actions, her own role in the department, and the undeniable tension hanging thick in the air. Director Mills turned to the desk sergeant. "I need all reports involving this incident filed immediately. Anything documented so far. Dashcam footage, body cam recordings, witness statements. I want them in my hands by the end of the day." "Understood." The sergeant nodded quickly, fumbling with the clipboard as he jotted down notes. Mills's tone left no room for negotiation. James stood motionless, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, observing every detail. He wasn't just watching Greg. He was watching everyone in the room. Years of experience had taught him that moments like these revealed true character, and he wasn't about to miss a single cue. Greg cleared his throat, his voice strained as he tried to salvage what little authority he thought he had left. "I think this has been blown out of proportion. I was just trying to do my job, keeping the streets safe." James turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "Keeping the streets safe," he repeated, his tone measured. "By handcuffing someone who didn't break the law? By ignoring your partner when she tried to tell you who I was? Tell me, Officer Miller, who exactly were you keeping safe?" Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding James's piercing gaze. Julia stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I tried to stop him," she said, directing her words to both James and Mills. "I told him you were FBI, but he didn't listen." James regarded her for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "I heard you," he said simply. Her relief was palpable, but it was short-lived. The tension in the room was building again, a storm waiting to break. Mills turned his attention to Greg, his voice sharp. "Officer Miller, let me be very clear. Your actions today were not only unprofessional, but they've also endangered the integrity of this department. This isn't just a lapse in judgment, it's a reflection of deeper issues that need to be addressed." Greg's face turned red, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You don't know what it's like out there," he said, his voice rising. "Every day, we're putting our lives on the line. Sometimes you have to make quick decisions." Quick decisions. Mills shot back, his voice cutting through Greg's protest like a knife. Or biased ones. The air seemed to crackle with tension, the weight of Mills's words settling over the room. Julia watched Greg closely, noticing the flicker of anger in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as if he were fighting to keep control. The door to the station opened again, and a tall woman in a navy blazer entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was followed by two men in plain clothes, their expressions serious. The woman approached Mills and James, nodding in acknowledgement. "Agent Carter," she said, her voice crisp. "I'm Special Agent Murray Thompson, Internal Affairs. We were briefed on the situation and are here to assist." James nodded, stepping aside as Thompson turned her attention to Greg. "Officer Miller, we'll need a statement from you regarding today's events, and we'll also need your body cam footage." Greg's face paled, but he didn't argue. He nodded stiffly, his movements robotic as he unhooked the device from his chest and handed it over. Thompson's team got to work quickly, their efficiency a stark contrast to the tension lingering in the room. Julia watched as they reviewed the footage, their expressions growing more serious with each passing minute. She couldn't see the screen, but she didn't need to. She already knew what it would show. James stepped closer to Mills, his voice low. "The footage will confirm everything. But we need to think about
Mills
what happens
nodded,
next." His expression
This
grim.
isn't just about accountability.
"We'll address it, James.
It's about
I
trust.
promise." The
If the
sound of
public
chairs
loses faith in the
scraping
system,
against the floor
this
broke
kind
the
of
momentary
thing
silence
will
as
only
Thompson's
keep happening.
team wrapped up their initial review. Thompson approached Mills, her face unreadable. "Director, we've seen enough to move forward. This is going to escalate quickly once the footage is released." Mills sighed, running a hand over his face. "I expected as much. Do what you need to do." As Thompson and her team prepared to leave, Greg's voice cut through the air, shaky but defiant. "This isn't fair. I was doing my job. I didn't mean for this to happen." James turned to him, his expression calm but resolute. "Intent doesn't erase impact, Officer Miller. What you did today wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a larger problem. And until people like you are held accountable, nothing will change." The room fell silent again, the weight of James' words sinking in. Julia looked down at her hands, her mind racing. She'd spent years telling herself that she was one of the good ones, that she was making a difference. But today had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her partner, about herself, and about the system she was part of. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the streets. The crowd that had gathered earlier had dispersed, but the ripple effects of what had happened were only just beginning to spread. Inside the station, the tension was palpable, a storm building toward its inevitable breaking point. Everyone in the room could feel it, the sense that this moment was bigger than any of them, that it was part of something larger and more complicated than any single person could control. And as James stood there, calm and steady amidst the chaos, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was far from over. As the weight of James' words settled over the room, the station door creaked open again. A man in his mid-30s stepped inside, dressed casually in jeans and a leather jacket, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his gaze scanning the room before landing on James. "Agent Carter," the man said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "I'm Agent Rand Porter, Internal Affairs. I was assigned to assist Agent Thompson's investigation." James nodded in acknowledgement, though his sharp instincts immediately picked up on something unusual about Porter's presence. Internal Affairs rarely sent additional agents unless something significant had come up. Porter approached Director Mills, lowering his voice. "We just got a hit on Agent Carter's name in an unrelated investigation. It's sensitive, but it's urgent." Mills frowned, glancing at James before stepping aside with Porter to discuss the matter privately. The quiet conversation, filled with hushed tones and occasional glances in James' direction, added a new layer of tension to the room. Julia shifted uncomfortably, her curiosity piqued. Greg, still standing near the desk, seized the opportunity to interject. "What's going on? Is this about him?" he asked, gesturing toward James with a smugness that betrayed his desperation for vindication. "No one asked you, Miller," Mills snapped, his tone sharp enough to shut Greg down immediately. James, for his part, remained calm, though his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Porter's arrival, coupled with a cryptic message, suggested there was more to this situation than he initially thought. After a few tense minutes, Mills and Porter returned, their expressions unreadable. Mills cleared his throat, addressing the room. "Agent Carter, we need to speak privately. Now." James nodded, following Mills and Porter into a small conference room down the hall. As the door closed behind them, Julia exchanged a glance with the desk sergeant, who shrugged helplessly. The atmosphere in the station felt heavier than ever, the unanswered questions hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Inside the conference room, Mills leaned against the table, his arms crossed. Porter placed a file on the table and opened it, revealing a series of documents and photographs. James stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. "What's this about?" James asked, his tone measured. Porter sighed, tapping one of the photos. "We've been investigating a string of corruption cases involving law enforcement officers. Bribes, cover-ups, you name it. Your name came up during a wiretap of a suspect we've been monitoring." James's brow furrowed as he studied the photo. It was of a man he didn't recognize, sitting at a diner booth with another man whose face was partially obscured. And Porter hesitated, exchanging a glance with Mills before continuing. "The suspect claimed to have an inside man in the FBI. He didn't say much, but he referenced you by name." James straightened, his expression hardening. "That's ridiculous. I don't know this man, and I've never been involved in anything remotely corrupt." "We don't believe you're involved," Mills said quickly, "but we need to understand why your name came up. It could be a misunderstanding, or it could be someone trying to frame you." James' mind raced, piecing together the implications. Someone was using his name to cover their tracks, and it wasn't just a random coincidence. This was deliberate, calculated. Porter closed the file and crossed his arms. "We need to tread carefully here. If this gets out, it could undermine your credibility and jeopardize the investigation into what happened today." James nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling over him. "Then let's figure out who's behind this. I'm not letting anyone use my name to hide their crimes." Back in the main station, Julia noticed the growing unease among the officers. The whispers were spreading, speculation running rampant about what was happening behind closed doors. She glanced at Greg, who was unusually quiet, his earlier confidence now replaced by a simmering frustration. "What do you think they're talking about?" she asked cautiously, her voice low. Greg shrugged, though his expression betrayed his curiosity. Probably trying to cover for him. You know how these things go. Julia frowned but said nothing. Something about Greg's tone didn't sit right with her. He sounded less like someone who felt wronged and more like someone trying to deflect blame. The door to the conference room opened suddenly, and James stepped out, his expression unreadable. Mills and Porter followed, their demeanor serious. James walked over to Julia, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Daniels, can I speak to you for a moment?" Julia blinked, surprised, but nodded. "Of course." He led her to a quiet corner of the station, away from prying eyes and ears. Once they were alone, he spoke in a low voice. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Julia nodded, her heart pounding. "Okay. Has Greg been acting? Unusual lately? Saying anything that struck you as odd or out of character?" Julia hesitated, her mind racing. She thought back to the past few weeks, replaying conversations and interactions. Greg had been more irritable than usual, complaining about department politics and making cryptic comments about how things weren't as black and white as they seemed. At the time, she brushed it off as his usual grumbling, but now, in the context of everything that had happened, it felt different. "There were a few things," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But I didn't think much of it at the time." "Why?" James's jaw tightened. "I can't say for sure yet, but I think there's more going on here than just today's incident. If you remember anything else, anything at all, I need you to tell me." Julia nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. "I will." As James walked away, her mind swelled with questions. What was really going on? And how much more was there to uncover? The tension in the station was reaching a breaking point, the unanswered questions piling up. Outside, the night had fully settled in, the city lights casting a cold glow over the streets. But inside, the storm was far from over, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered.